everyone, welcome to another live session on reed making. Sorry about the mess in the background. I'm doing all kinds of stuff and reorganizing and all that good stuff. Today I thought it would be helpful to talk about how sharp your knife should be. Very often as oboe players we talk about the importance of a sharp knife, but when I have a lot of beginner reed makers, the problems that I see are that they're not realizing that their knife isn't sharp enough. So I'm just gonna go ahead and this is just gonna be a short video today, and I'm gonna show you a couple of tests and things that you can do to make sure that your knife is sharp. And we'll also talk about the anatomy of your knife, how it's made a little bit, and I'll make a few recommendations on that. So let me just go ahead and switch over to my camera. All right, there's my stones right there, and there they are, my knives. All right. Let's get this a little bit centered so you can see. All right, so like I said, one of the biggest things that we overlook is how is that a dull knife. So we know that it's important to have a sharp knife, but sometimes it's hard to know what that looks like when you're scraping. So one of the things that I tell new reed makers from the very beginning is to try scraping on a piece of tube cane. If you don't know what this is just how reeds start out. I think if you have a teacher, you can ask to have an old piece of tube cane. Sometimes if you ask a double reed supplier to sell you just one tube, they might be able to do that. I know Barton Cane was able to do it for one of my students in my course. So it might be worth a shot to ask, but I highly recommend doing this because you still get the feel of scraping on a reed, but you don't have the mistakes coming with it. So, and then it's just easier to transfer that over. So when I test the sharpness of my knives, I really just test it on the tip, on my nail, and I test it with the weight of my knife, and I make sure that it just kind of sticks to my nail. Of course, that's a great place to start, but it's not going to really tell you the whole picture until you start scraping. One of the problems, so when I start scraping, I look for the bark right here. If you can see, I look for these like curls where they're consistent. If I have to press down too much, I know that it's not quite sharp enough for me. So then I go ahead. So you want to make sure that you're not having to press down. I do like to have a little bit of pressure. There's something about if you don't have any pressure at all, it just doesn't really scrape very well, or it doesn't work. So that's something, but it still sticks for me. But I still like to have pressure so that I can get those consistent curls. So that's one way to check it. Of course, the real test is how your knife is scraping your tip. So you really want to be able to use as light of pressure as possible. And you should still be able to take off some cane. This tip is a little bit dry, but I'll show you. So I'm hardly using any pressure, and I should be able to just very easily pull off a little bit of cane. Now, if you find that you're just ripping off your tips, that might be that your knife is not smooth enough, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Like the edge isn't smooth. So you shouldn't have to press down at all, like especially when you're working in your tip. If you find that I just pulled off a tiny corner there, if you find that you're doing that, it might just be time to kind of resharpen it. All right, so let's talk about what we look for in the knife. So that's just kind of checking how it's scraping. Just one other thing, if you find that your knife is chattering a lot, or it's going, it might just be that your knife is almost too sharp and too, it might be worth just lightening. So this is a good way on this piece of cane to check the different pressures that you need for your specific knife. So I love Landwell knives. This is what I use. This is my favorite kind of knife, but I'm not a big fan of how they come out of the box. They seem to chatter a lot right away. Once that they break in a little bit and I use it, it just works perfectly for me. But just to give you a heads up, there's a little bit of a chatter sometimes that I find with the new Landwell knives. Even though they are my favorite, that's just something to just kind of keep an eye on. And you just have to learn how the knife feels. So if you find that you're pressing down a lot, that's the time to sharpen your knife. If you find that you have to turn your knife like this a lot, that means your burr is not kind of lined up right. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And if you find that you have to do this, so you don't want to have any kind of weird angles when you're scraping. You want to be as perpendicular as possible with just a little bit of pressure and able to get those consistent curls off of your cane. And then of course the real test comes to how it scrapes. So just a quick overview of the anatomy of the knife, so we could talk a little bit about that. I highly recommend this book. This is the Jendi book of sharpening, and this was really a huge eye-opener. I love this book. I don't exactly sharpen my knives perfectly like this, but I really do like it a lot because it really does help understand the reed a little bit more. And then also this book, Understanding the Oboe Reed, does have a blurb on knife sharpening that's worth reading. So there's a huge little section in that huge book. So one of the things that's really important, I like to use a double hollow ground, which is what the Landwell knife is. And just to give you, a lot of people like to use beveled knives. I'm not a big fan of them, so I use double hollow, but it doesn't mean that you can't use one if it's what you prefer, but it just means the double hollow is the blade is hollowed out on each side with a grinding wheel into a point. And then Landwell does a little something extra. They add like a little bit of a relief here. That's what this is called right here, the relief. I'm not really sure why they do that. I'm not going to pretend that I know that much about knives because I really don't. But that's what the hollow ground is, and that's what I like. I think they're lighter and they just tend to be sharper and they work very nicely for me. But at the end of every knife, there's something called a little burr, which is this tiny piece of metal right here. And this is what we want to make sure is super sharp. We also want to make sure it's smooth, and that's what your sharpening stones, we'll talk about that in another video at some point. I have a question here, soft, medium soft, or hard Landwell? I like the mediums. I think it's just a medium. I don't think it's a medium soft, but that's what I use. Yeah, so the burr right here, that's what you want to have really sharp and smooth. I'm gonna see if I can make that a little clearer. So if this is your scraping side right here, your burr is gonna want to be turned in. So so it's not enough to get your knife sharp, and Jendi explains that in the book very well. You also have to get it smooth, and that's where the finer grit of the stones come in. I have another Facebook question. This is not an Arkansas stone right here. This is a ceramic water stone. Awesome. I'm getting questions for the first time. This is great. I'm also getting distracted. So yeah, so this is the burr. It needs to be sharp and smooth. So that's where you start by getting a higher grit on your sharpening stone. And that's why if you find that your knife is pulling off the tip, it might just be that it's not smooth enough. So there's little microscopic jaggedy edges that will affect the way that you scrape your knife. I'm sorry, that will find that when you scrape your tip off, that it's pulling off your tip. So that's where you want to get into the finer stone. And then also something to think about, if you're having problems, you've sharpened your knife for a long time, you've got it on a fine stone, but it's just not getting sharp enough, you're not able to scrape, it's kind of doing this thing where it slides on your knife, on your reed, which is really frustrating, and you've spent hours sharpening. It might just be simply because your burr is not turned in the right direction compared to how you're scraping. So if you're scraping in a 90-degree pattern, you might want to experiment with how far your burr is turned. So that would be, this is my burnishing rod. You can kind of experiment with that by just moving the burr into the correct angle, and you just kind of have to experiment with that a little bit. You can also do that on a ceramic stone. I just love I love the rod because it doesn't really take off any steel. It just kind of pushes the burr in the right direction. So this is a okay, you'll have to forgive me if I'm saying this wrong. I call it Museco, but it's a Museco burnishing rod. All right, so that's how to check and make sure your knife is sharp enough. And again, you really want it to just stick to your nail. That's a great place to start. Then try scraping, and a safe place to scrape on is a piece of tube cane, and just get the feel of your knife and how it scrapes before you move on to the tip. Now I don't obviously do that because I really understand my knife now, but if I have a new knife, or even my Museco knife here, which is a great knife, it's different than the Landwell, so it's great to just scrape on the bark a lot to just get used to how it feels. All right, thanks so much for watching, and I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you feel free to put any comments, and I will try to answer them as best as I can. And I think I will see you next week. Bye guys, have a good one.